Today we're going to take a look at day 1 of graphing sine and cosine. So a quick review of what we did with the spaghetti graphing here. We looked at a unit circle and we had those key points. So this was 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, 0, negative 1. And we started out, if you guys remember, by drawing in all the right triangles and measuring the height. And if we measured the height, we said that was the y part of the triangle. So that was the graph, our sine of x graph. And if we graph this, we said there was key points at pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So, and then we made this graph. The height starts at 0. At pi over 2, it's at 1. Pi, the height is 0. Down here at 3 pi over 2, so we're looking at all these heights here, it was at negative 1 and 0. And we said this pattern would continue. So whether we went forwards or backwards or kept going around the circle. So then we started to take a look at what would the width look like if we were to measure the x part. So we said that's y equals the cosine of x. And so if we were to graph this again, we have those critical points at pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. 1 and negative 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. But the width, so if we were to go back up here and take a look at the width here, it starts at 1, 0, negative 1, and 0. So at 0 degrees, our width is really at 1. So it looks similar to the sine graph, except it has a different starting place because we're measuring that width. So then what we started to do today is in the investigation on Desmos, we started to look at what if there were some numbers here. And A was your amplitude, which meant the height of the graph. So we could change that. B was used to calculate the wavelength or our period, because they're periodic, they start to repeat themselves. And that was calculated at 2 pi over B. So let's take a look at a couple examples. If we had y equals 3 the sine of 2x, our amplitude is 3, our period would be 2 pi over 2, which reduces down to pi. So when we graph this, we're still going to have those 4 critical points, but it's done at pi. So we have to figure out what all these are. Well, the middle one would be pi over 2, pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4, because we're counting by pi over 4. And I shouldn't say done when it starts to repeat. Our amplitude, so I'm going to just keep the label here, 3 and negative 3. Sine starts in our middle. So it's going to look really similar, but it's our labeling on our scales that lets us know that it's not exactly the same. If we were to label this on a regular scale, these waves would be closer and closer together. So let's take a look at y equals negative 2 cosine of 2/3 x. So our amplitude was 2, and we got a negative there. We'll see what happens there. Our period, 2 pi divided by 2/3, which is 2 pi times 3 over 2. So it's 3 pi. So if we were to graph this, our amplitude 2 and negative 2. We have those 4 critical marks on each side. So this is 3 pi. 1, 2, 3, 4. This mark would be, well, 3 pi over 4, because it's a fourth of it. Well, what's half of 3 pi is 1 1/2 pi, so 3 pi over 2. And this, if we're counting by 4s, this would be 3 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4. So we have 9 pi over 4. And now where does this one start? Well, it's a cosine. So if we go back up here, cosine started high. It started at 1. But we have that negative cosine. So rather than start high, it's going to start low, middle, high, middle, low. And then we can continue the pattern right there. So let's take a look at one more. What if we had y equals 3 the sine of 4, maybe we'll use a theta instead of an x. Amplitude is 3. Our period is 2 pi over 4. So that's pi over 2. So if we were to graph this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have pi over 2. Well, that's half of pi over 2 would be a fourth pi. Half of pi over 4, we got pi over 8. So that's what we're counting by. 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8. So this would be 3 pi over 8. Amplitude, so we'd mark 3 and negative 3. And it's a sine. Sine starts in the middle, and it's positive, so it would go up, middle, down, middle. Now, let's say we were given a graph. And maybe we were only given part of the graph, and it looked like this. And we were asked to write an equation for it. Well, I see the starting value. It starts right here, so right away that's going to tell me it's a cosine. Our amplitude is going to be 5, but we have to figure out that b value. So our period on this graph, it starts to make a full length of a wave, would be pi over 2. So we know 2 pi over b equals pi over 2. Fraction bust this, multiply it by 2b. So if we distribute that, that would be 2 pi times 2 equals b times pi. So 4 pi equals b times pi. So b has to be 4. So this would be the cosine of 4x.